So again, as Mike said, I've been doing computers for 34 years, earned all of these gray hairs. I've written 12 books, over 1,100 magazine articles. There's some of my books. My most recent one is Hacking Multi-Factor Authentication. I work for KnowBe4. We're the world's largest integrated security awareness training simulated phishing platform vendor. We try to help people to teach their friends and coworkers not to get phished. But today we're talking about passwords. And I tell you what, if you've never seen me before, I talk fast. I do it all the time. I'm a fire hose of information. If there's something you don't get, don't worry. You can have my slide deck. But I really do think that this talk is one of the best presentations on password attacks and defenses. And if you've ever tried to figure out what should my password policy be, I think this is a good talk for you to see over the next 55 minutes. But, we all know that passwords have their, own problems. They get hacked all the time. People forget them. Sometimes when you've been using them forever and they give you a new password, you keep using the old password, so they're hard to forget. One of the biggest problems, they get reused. The same passwords get reused across multiple websites and services, which means if one of those get hacked, then the hackers can use them on the other websites. It's something, I think the stat is the average person has like 3 to 7 passwords that they use across over 70 websites. So there's a lot of resharing going on. But there's some good things about passwords. If they get stolen, we can generate a new one, and works with nearly everything versus something like multi-factor authentication, which you often hear is going to replace it. That maybe works with maybe 2% of the world's websites and services. And it can be secure. It can be secure if it's protected and used appropriately and you don't get socially engineered out of it. But the biggest problem with passwords today, again, is this password reuse. It says, the average person, not 70 websites, the average person has to log into 170 plus websites and only has 3 to 19 passwords to share among those sites. I guess it's the latest data I put in there. So if a hacker compromises one of your websites or services, they can try to hack you in other places. Like a lot of times people will get hacked on or socially engineered out of their, Facebook or Twitter, Instagram password. And then the attacker will see, well, can they log into Instagram or that person's bank or, at work or something like that. There's all kinds of different ways to attack passwords for an attacker to do it. I've got, I guess, 7 ways here, and I'm going to cover most of these. I think I cover actually 8. By the end, but I want to talk about all of these so that you'll understand why I recommend the password policy that I do. Certainly, physical attacks is a very common way for somebody to obtain a victim's password. They can be shoulder surfing, over your shoulder as you type it in. I've seen Post-it notes before under laptops. I've seen them on walls. I think we've probably all seen a newscast where a reporter's interviewing somebody, and right behind the person, you can see on the whiteboard, the password is. Or in this case, this is actually a Post-it note I saw on a laptop in a government building. I was doing a presentation for a state and for the state of, and they put me in a public conference room that anybody in the world could walk into. It was a public conference room for the public to use, and it actually had this username and password in a sticky note on a laptop where anybody could see it. And I remember saying to the guy that led me there, I was like, I sure hope that isn't a network password. I hope that's only for the local laptop that I'm presenting on. The guy responded, if that makes you feel better, you can tell yourself that. So those Post-it notes are everywhere. Social engineering is the most common way to get a password from somebody, where you get this phishing email that says, oh, we're LinkedIn and we need you to log in to check your security or whatever it might be. It could be a fake website you get tricked into visiting. It could be, a social media site. Someone sends you a message, click here to see this funny joke, and it installs malware and steals your password. But social engineering is responsible for somewhere between 40 to over 90% of all successful data breaches. Where someone sends you a fake Instagram, is like, click here. Someone tried to log into your Instagram account. We need you to verify that it wasn't you. Click in here, so it scares people in the check-in. Or here's a fake. This is a phishing email that I got sent that was telling me that I needed to log into my KnowBe4 email. But if you look at the URL at the top, it's not knowbefore.com like I would normally think. It's really at this CarkWeb 5132B appspot.com. It's not knowbefore.com at all. Not to mention it actually didn't look that much like our regular KnowBe4 mail, but occasionally I guess they could get it right. Or here's even an email. This was sent to one of our clients saying, hey, you need to take your KnowBe4 training. And if you look at the URL, it's kind of sneaky. It says knowbefore.com b.e4.com. So our real URL is knowbefore.com, but they broke it up into knowwb.e4.com. And if you actually hovered over the link, you could see it really went to this turbo builder NI or whatever, Nigeria, or oh, that's RU Russia. They got bad eyes. But definitely it is not knowbefore.com, but very common way to get people's passwords. Sometimes they just guess, so they'll get into a login portal and they'll do it manually or with an automation tool or using malware and just try to guess people's passwords. Brute force method is the slowest, where they do like AA, AB, AC, ABC, just trying it. Most attackers will do a dictionary attack. They'll download a whole bunch of words, usually 10,000 to maybe 100,000 words, and they use that kind of like as the root word of the password, and they'll uppercase some characters and add some numbers and special characters in there. So dictionary attacks are the most common way where you'll try to take a get. If you know the person, oh, they're a baseball fan, you can guess, or they're a golf fan, you can try those sorts of. I remember one time I went to a CEO's desk or in his office, and I was trying to. I was paid to do password hacking, and I walked in the CEO's office, and he had a bunch of golfing pictures all around him, and I was able. His password was Titleist. So wasn't that, only had to guess a couple of times to figure out what it was. But a lot of times most people, when they create a password, most people have a working vocabulary of only about 3,000 to 4,000 words, maybe a maximum of 10,000 words if you're super literate. And most people's passwords have some type of password, some type of word in it, what's called the root word, and they just uppercase, lowercase. Matter of fact, most people, if they're required to use a complex password, will do an uppercase consonant of that word followed by a lowercase letter, which is usually a vowel, A, E, I, O, or O, or U. And then if they're told they have to have a number in it, they'll usually have a 1 or a 2 and it's at the end. And hackers kind of know these rules and can build that into their password guessing attacks. They just have to find some type of logon prompt that they can guess against, like a Google Gmail account or Office 365 or a Cisco VPN or something like that. If it doesn't require that they have multi-factor authentication, they can just put in the person's email address or logon name and just start guessing passwords, trying, as long as they don't validate what's called the account lockout policy or something like that. So sometimes hackers will manually guess at them. Most of the time they use these automated tools. Here's some examples of different tools: Brutus and WebBrute and Canonable. On the bottom right hand is one called Hydra with THC in there, and that one is a really common one. And the reason why is if they use automated tools, sometimes they can guess like up to 50,000 times a day at a single prompt, and that would be very difficult for a manual attacker to do it. Sometimes they do things called password stuffing attacks or password spray attacks, and so the typical traditional password attack tries to guess a whole bunch of different passwords against one account, but a credential stuffing attack or spray attack actually takes as many accounts they can get from the company, and they try a smaller number of passwords, maybe only up to 1,000. And usually if they go across a large number of accounts, there'll be somebody with a weak account that they'll be able to break into. But they do it one at a time slowly, and they try not to exceed the rate that would kick the account lockout. These are very common. Acme, which is one of the world's largest internet-based companies, said they saw 61 billion credential stuffing attacks in a year and a half. So that is how common credential stuffing attacks are. They're oftentimes used to break into companies. FBI, for example, told Citrix that they think the hackers likely got in using a password spray attack. Very, very common. And a lot of times they're against the application programming interfaces. A lot of large companies have these interfaces that other computer systems on the internet can connect to download data, upload data, or massage data through this application programming interface API. A lot of them allow logons. And if they do, many times the attackers will try to do password guessing against the API because the APIs are rarely protected, they're not monitored well, and they usually don't have account lockout enabled on them. And Acme said the 75% of those attacks were used against APIs. So if you have an API, make sure that you're monitoring that API logon portal and that you have account lockout enabled on that API if you can enable it. There's even a tool called Spray or Spray Shell Script that any hacker can download from GitHub that literally does password spray attacks, where you just tell it, hey, I want to try an HTTP login or Cisco login or Outlook for Web Access login. And then here's the target IP address or domain name of the server that we're going to guess against. Here's the file name of the username list. Here's the file name of the password dictionary we're using. Here's how many attempts we can do per lockout period and how long between different, we can only guess like 6 times in 30 minutes or whatever it might be, and we'll only guess that. And here's kind of just an example of me running this in a lab where I'm like, hey, use the spray attack against Cisco. It's a Cisco login. And I want you to guess only 20 times in 1,440 minutes, which I think is all day. I think this number of minutes in a day or something like that. But anyways, there's an example of finding that. And password spray attacks, again, very, very successfully used against many companies on the web today. But password spray attacks and guessing attacks only work with truly weak passwords, like really like password or password 123 or 12345 or 1234567 or admin or QWERTY. If you look at the top 10 most common, or in this case, the top 8 most common passwords have been used across the different years, you're going to see that a lot of them are alike, right? It's password. Sadly, password is the most common password. 123456 is very common. 1234567 is very common. QWERTY is very common. ABC123 very common. Football, baseball, let me in, dragon, I love you, and things like that. So they'll try these different types of passwords, and you'll be surprised, even if your company has a long and complex password policy. A lot of times there's some legacy account that couldn't be upgraded with a better password policy, and there's some weak password sitting in there that they take advantage of. 75% of organizations have at least one user on a password on a list of 1,000 passwords. And attackers know that, so they don't all the time have to be like super innately brilliant to figure out somebody's password. And again, most complex passwords really aren't that complex. It's an uppercase consonant followed by a lowercase vowel, and when there's a number, it's a 1 or a 2, and it's at the end, and that sort of stuff. So guessing, sometimes they don't really even have to guess. There's a lot of hard-coded default passwords, especially in like wireless routers and switches and bridges and that sort of stuff. All you got to do is Google or Bing. You can put in default password list, and it will bring up hundreds and hundreds of devices and go, here's the default password. And most people, especially consumers at home, don't change the passwords, but there's many people at work and many organizations that don't change those default passwords. So the attackers and malware will try them. These days, the most popular malware is what's called, IoT, Internet of Things. It's like web cameras, DVRs, and they will try guessing 100 different passwords against the admin account. And many times they will be successful against those accounts because they usually will try the default passwords, and they oftentimes will work. There's a lot of password guessing malware out there that will try to guess against devices and login portals and network shares, and they'll usually guess 100 or so common passwords. Conficker was that was back in the 2000s or something, 2006, something like that, and that guessed at 100 passwords. Today, it's Mote or Cobot. These are Russian, Ukrainian bot programs that will attempt to brute force different domain credentials or network shares. Very, very common. They have broken into hundreds of millions of devices around the world. They're among the most common malware we see today. It used to be the most common malware was like PC-based malware, but these days it's IoT devices and web cameras and routers and things like that are taken over. So if you're trying to prevent password guessing, change any default passwords immediately when you get a new device in or PC or whatever. Use strong passwords, enable account lockout policies. Make sure you monitor failed logins. So if you see an unusual number of them, that you can alert on it and respond to it. Make sure you secure and monitor your APIs the same as you would any login portal. And if you can use multi-factor authentication, that's a good thing to try as well. Another type of attack, and this is probably one of the more advanced types of attacks, is called password hash cracking. And that's where an attacker somehow is able to obtain the password hash of the password. Most of you all probably already know, but if you don't know, when you type in your plain text password into an operating system, so let's say that your plain text password is frog, it immediately gets converted in using a cryptographic hash program. And in Windows, there's 2 types of hashes: LM landman hash or NT hash. and it will store that password in a password database. In Windows, the local password database is called the SAM, Security Accounts Management Database. It's stored in the SAM and kind of the registry. It's a hybrid. If it's on an Active Directory network, it's put on domain controllers in a file called ntds.dit. Windows machines will store, when you type in a password, we're typically only by default today stored as the NT hash because the LM hash is determined to be very hackable and weak. Linux and Unix and Apple systems used to store them as MD5 hashes, but today I think they're usually SHA-1, SHA-2 hashes. SHA-1's kind of vulnerable, so SHA-2 is what most people are using. If you're lucky, your operating system uses bcrypt. That's by Bruce Schneier, and it's probably the most secure hash, up to a 55 character password. After 55 characters, there's one called PBKDF2. PBKDF2. That can be as strong as pbcrypt, but can actually go past 55 characters, which is kind of nice. But anyways, when hackers, if they get a hold of password hashes, the idea is if you get this hash, or the attacker gets this hash, they don't know your plain text password, but they will do what's called password hash cracking. They have to steal it first, and to steal your password hash, most of the time they have to be an administrator on your machine, a local administrator, a domain administrator, or root. So normally a regular user can't just access and get their hash, but if you get tricked by malware, or you allow a hacker in and they're able to obtain local system, local administrator, domain administrator, or root for Linux or Apple systems or something, then they can access those hashes. On a Linux system in Apple, they're stored in a file called the password could be in one called passwd, and then where they put the hash is called the shadow file. They can oftentimes find it there, but if they can extract that password hash theft tool, or password hash, they can try to guess against it. They can even, I teach another webinar, and I talk about this a lot, where I can actually send you an email, and if I can trick you into clicking on the URL of the email, if you have a Windows integrated, if you have a Windows system, I can actually get your hash from across the internet and start to crack it. Well, what happens again is that if an attacker gets your hash, and normally they have to be administrator or root or something like that, they can't immediately go, oh, that hash equals this password. But what they do is what's called hash cracking, or rainbow table cracking, which is a slight derivation of that, is that they upload a password hash database. So they take a whole bunch of passwords, or possible passwords, like billions of possible passwords, right? Your password, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, letters, symbols in there, and they pre-hash it. Then they upload that database into the hash cracking program. In this case, I'm showing you OptCrack. It's a Windows program. It's not the most popular one. The most popular one is a Linux program called Hashcat. And then they upload it, and they get that hash there, and they have the stolen hashes, and they'll try to see if one of the pre-computed hashes matches one of the stolen hashes, and if they do, then they can figure out what the password is. So this is called password hash cracking. Again, most passwords on most operating systems are stored as the password hash. If the attacker can get that hash, they can then do this comparison, rainbow table password hash cracking comparison, and try to get the plain text password. And again, there's different types of, how fast they can guess at your password kind of depends on the hash that you're using. If you have an older Windows system, or you're somehow using something, use landman LM hashes, they're trivial. They can break it in seconds. MD5, RC4, and RC5 are hash types that are considered very easy to crack, that you really shouldn't use them. NT hashes, which are used in Windows today, and Kerberos, moderately hard to crack. It takes some force to do it. SHA-1, SHA-2 hash is used in Linux and Apple and stuff like that, are hard to crack. PBKDF2 is used in Windows 7 for what's called logon caching. Very, very hard to crack. And bcrypt by Bruce Schneier, very, very hard to crack, up to 55 characters. But what hackers will do is buy these graphical processing unit cards that people used to just use for gaming because they could do raw calculations faster. And they'll buy a bunch of these and put them in a computer. Like we have a computer at Noble4 that has 8 of these GPUs, and we're getting ready to buy a system that has 100 of them. But they can do literally billions of guesses per second, and there's lots of what's called password hash cracking rigs out there. Like for $25,000, you can get one that has 375 GPUs in it, and you can use cloud computing and cluster computing, parallel processors and stuff. Right now, the world record for password hash cracking here on a single GPU rig. So this is a rig that has only one graphical processing unit, is 121 billion guesses per second. The world record, though, for just the most powerful computer trying it is 350 billion password tries per second. So even if your password is moderately long, let's say 10 to 12 characters with some complexity, because it can guess hundreds of billions of times a second, they can possibly obtain your password. Certainly, an 8-character, if you have a Windows, this is important. If you have a 8-character Windows password, if they get the hash to that password, they can crack it in under 2 hours or 12 minutes using $25 of cloud processing power. So let me say that again. If you have an 8-character Windows password, regardless of the complexity, they can crack it in under 2 hours. If you want to prevent your captured password hash from being converted back into the plain text password, you need like a 16-character password. So that's what's really, really important here. This determines how difficult or strict your password policies are going to be, but you need a 16-character Windows password if you want to prevent password hash cracking from being used against you. Really, I think publicly, we only know of a 12-character password that has ever been broken. But lots of people assume that nation states, the United States, the NSA, and NIST, and China, and Russia, they assume that they have a lot of processing power and money and resources, and that they are probably able to crack larger than 12-character passwords. So everybody kind of said, if you want to prevent your password, your Windows password, from being cracked if the hash is stolen, and that's a big if, they got to get to your hash, then you want to have at least a 16-character password with complexity. And we don't even know. Maybe the nation states can break that. We don't know. But most people feel like if you have a 16-character password, you're going to be fairly safe. Although if an attacker gets your hash, they really don't have to crack it. If they want to crack it, cracking it gets, if they're successful, they get your plain text password and they can then use that to log on in. But a lot of times, if they capture your hash, remember, most of the time they have to be admin or domain admin or something like that, then they can replay that hash and use that. If they're on a Windows network, if they're on your Windows computer, they can actually log into other computers and other systems using just your hash on a Windows system. Instead of putting in your password, they can log on in and just use your hash, and that will work on a Windows system and a Windows network. What's called pass the hash attack tools. Lots of tools out there in the Microsoft world, Windows world, like Mimikatz is one of the big ones that will help. If attacker gets on your system as local administrator or local system, they can run Mimikatz and they can download your hashes and then replay them and use them to log on to other computers. It's a pretty powerful type of tool. WinCE. Wince is another type of tool. Or on the Linux systems, they have one called Ntlm Relay, actually X. It's a Python script. And the example at the very bottom of the screen, that's the syntax that I would use if I'd captured somebody's hash. I could log into any other computer within the domain with the victim's logon name and hash, and inject shell code, meaning malicious code that I wanted to put on that system. So lots of ways to do it. Very popular type of attack. These days, a lot of times, most of the time, hackers don't bother with cracking hashes because they can just replay the hashes, and they don't have to worry about how long your password is or take it through all those GPUs and that sort of stuff. But your defense, if you're trying to stop hash cracking, number one defense is stop the attackers from getting to your hashes in the first place. Stop them from being admin, domain admin, or root, because if they have that, they can do anything. They can just keylog you instead. Instead of cracking your password hash, they could just put a keylogger and you type in your password, and they don't care how long or short it is. They take it that way. But if they do get your hash, if you have a very long and complex password, 16 characters or more with complexity, it's probably going to stop most people from cracking it. You can also use antivirus and endpoint detection response software to prevent hacking tools like Mimikatz from being used to steal your stuff. And different individual vendors like Microsoft has like 10 different settings that can try to stop pass the hash attacks and people from stealing the hashes, things what's called like protected LSAS, or admin level RDP. When I was at Microsoft, we created a whole bunch of processes and features. Most of them are not enabled by default because they can create some problems, like protected LSAS is one of those. But Microsoft very much tries to stop people from stealing hashes. Every major update, they're putting in defenses to stop that, but then the attackers just update their tools, and it's always in kind of a little war. But let me say this again: if you want to stop your password hashes from being cracked, don't let them get stolen in the first place. Because again, remember, if they've got your hashes, most of the time they're already in as keys to the kingdom, right? They're already in as local administrator, local system, root. And this is a big difference, the only difference is that they could also, if they send you an email and get you to click on a link, and I teach an entire another webinar on this. If I can trick you into clicking onto that link and you have a Windows system, I can many times trick your system into sending me your password hash. There is a Microsoft patch you can apply, but it's optional, and no system I've ever been on has ever applied that patch. But if you're interested in that attack, send me an email at rogerg@knowbefore.com, and I'll send you my article on it. But just know that if you have a Windows system and I can trick you into clicking on a link, I can probably get your hash. And so I can get your password hash and start cracking it without you even being aware of it. And lots of ways that I can just steal your password, right? Social engineering or malware or eavesdropping. There's lots of places, a lot of password attacks, they just steal it some way, right? The malware gets in your system and steals it, or they keylog it, or they're network eavesdropping, or they trick you into going to a fake site or something like that, or then physically someone could look over your shoulder. Lots of ways your passwords are being stolen. If malware gets on the endpoint these days, it's on your device. The most common one these days for malware is called Trickbot. Trickbot, as soon as it executes, tries to find every password in memory. It tries to find them on the disk. It looks in your browser, steals them from your browser cache and your network manager logins and stuff like that. Here's an example of the passwords that a Trickbot Trojan stole from a company. It got people's Office 365 accounts. It got their passwords to their password managers. It got them to their medical supply services, their state and local government competitive bidding portals, shipping and postage accounts that the company was using, and Amazon, Facebook, LinkedIn, Microsoft, Twitter, Instagram. The trick is, if the malware is on your system, it can keylog you. So you're going to Amazon buying something, or you're checking your bank balance or your stock or something like that, and it's stealing the passwords and sending them to the bad guys. And hackers, even if they're on your network, they can run tools like this is an example picture of Empire PowerShell. It's got lots of hacking modules, but it literally can try to sniff your passwords, steal your passwords, do all kinds of evil type of tricks. Empire PowerShell is one of the most popular hacker toolkits in the world. It has over 285 hacking modules, and many of them are just dedicated to trying to find your password, including Mimikatz. I showed you a screenshot of that before. That's a Windows-based tool that will sniff your password hashes out of memory, and then can use them to do what's called pass the hash attacks across the network to log into other computers. There's Mimikatz again. So again, if someone is able to get in your system and be administrator, they can get the password hash and then try to crack it. There's another thing called the Metasploit Framework. That's another hacking tool that can help them try to steal your password. These are probably the three most popular tools for accomplishing password attacks on any network today. And there's new tools that come up every couple of years, but these three are used by almost every real world hacker there is. They can eavesdrop on your network and do man-in-the-middle attacks. Like I can send you an email and I say that I'm from LinkedIn. You click on it, it's not really LinkedIn. And so you're in this man-in-the-middle website, and then everything you type in gets sent to the real LinkedIn, and everything LinkedIn would normally send you gets sent to you, but you just don't know that there's this proxy man-in-the-middle website that's capturing your login name and password and your password hash and that sort of stuff. There's even a tool called Responder anybody could download. That tool is built for hackers or white hat hackers to fake being that man-in-the-middle proxy website. This is a free tool that all kinds of people use, and I don't have time to show you this demo today, but just know this is a great demo that if you watch it, Kevin Mitnick, he's our chief hacking officer, he actually sends an email to somebody, and all they do is open the email and click on the link, and next thing you know, he's capturing their NT password hash using this responder tool. Because again, what responder is faking being a website, and when the person clicks on the link and it tries to connect to this website, the responder tool is like, oh, you need to log into me. And the browser, using what's called integrated Windows authentication, attempts to negotiate a login. And from that, responder actually reveals the NT hash. And then Kevin cracks that hash in like 30 seconds. And it used to be very uncommon, this type of attack. It's becoming more common today. Again, let me say this again. If I can get you clicking on a link, I can sometimes steal your NT hash. And then sometimes your password is just all over the internet. There are literally 30 billion login names and passwords all over the internet. Like this one file that was called Collection 1 and Collection 2, they had over 3 billion login names and passwords. So hackers for years have done social engineering attacks and man-in-the-middle attacks, and they capture everybody's password and they put it in a file somewhere out there on the internet. I think there's 15 billion login names and passwords. And a lot of times the passwords are old, but a lot of times they can see patterns. Like the person's, oh, I can see they're doing frog 1, frog 2, frog 3, frog 4, and they see that pattern. Like, oh, I'm going to go try to log into that person's account and try frog 5 or frog 6. There's a lot of hacking tools out there that allow people to look in those lists. I can literally say, using this tool called Recon NG, it has these reconnaissance modules. I can literally go, okay, I'm trying to break in no4.com, show me every login name and password that's out there in any of these hacker databases. So they'll actually go look and go, okay, here's the 150 login names and passwords that we have that belong to KnowBe4, and here's their passwords. If you're interested, you can actually go to KnowBe4 and download our password exposure test tool. I'll show you that, talk about it more in a minute. But if you download that tool, it can actually look on the internet for your entire company and tell you how many login names and passwords are out there on the internet, and do you have weak passwords and that sort of stuff. There's also this great site. This was started by a Microsoft employee called Have I Been Pwned? Every one of you can go to Have I Been Pwned? You put in your email address or your login name, and it will look to see whether or not your login name and password has been compromised. Like in the first example on the left here, I put in rogerg@knowbe4.com. That's my email address. And hey, you've not been found. Your password is not in any of those 15 billion lists that we have out there. But I put in my real long-term, my personal, that's my personal email there, roger@banner@cs.com. I've had it for 30 years or however long the internet's been around. It's like, hey, your password was found on 10 breach sites. And they weren't things that I did. I mean, it could have been socially engineered, but when I look into Have I Been Pwned, it's like, oh, Adobe got compromised. Facebook got compromised, Twitter got compromised. So different websites and services that I belong to got compromised, and at those times my password got compromised. So this is why you should always change. Don't reuse them don't use the same password between different websites, and make sure you change your passwords at least once a year, because your passwords and old passwords could be out there in these lists that it's not that hard for hackers to look up. And again, if you want to in a corporate way, you can go download our password exposure test tool, and it will check to see if anybody in your company's passwords are out there on the internet, and we'll tell you how many are out there, and then we'll let you know if any of them are weak and that sort of stuff. Account takeover recoveries. These are methods where another type of password attack method where hackers can just reset or bypass somebody's login account password or MFA, like password reset questions. We've seen those where, you're like, oh, I don't remember my password. And then they're like, what's your mother's maiden name? What's the last 4 digits of your social security number? What's your favorite car? What's your favorite vet? These questions are horrible because your password could have like a trillion different possibilities, but what's your mother's maiden name? That can be looked up on the internet. I can go to Ancestry.com and look it all up. Or they're like, what's your favorite car? Well, there's only like 100 different cars in the world, brands at any one time. They're usually the same, mostly year to year and decade to decade. And most people are going to pick something like a Lamborghini or a Corvette or a Lexus or something like that. They're not going to pick like an AMC Gracer or Gremlin or something like that. So if you were to ask me to guess your favorite car, I'm probably going to be able to guess it within 10 to 20 guesses. I may never be able to guess your password, but I can probably guess your favorite car or something like that. So whenever you have these password reset questions, don't give them the real answers. Google actually did a white paper years ago called Secret Lies and Account Recovery Lessons Learned from the Personal Use of Personal Knowledge Questions at Google. And they said, 20% of some recovery questions could be guessed on the first try by a hacker. So 1 out of 5 questions could be guessed on the first try by a hacker. 40% of people were unable to successfully recall their own legitimate recovery answers. I don't know if that means or maybe you should call a hacker to help you remember your answer. Many hackers have recovered people's accounts using these personal knowledge questions. Sarah Palin, she ran for vice president with John McCain against Biden and Obama. Biden's back. But some Democratic representative's son tried to hack her Yahoo, and so he got into he reset her Yahoo account. It asked her 3 questions, one of which was like, where'd you meet your husband? And he had read that it was at Wasilla High School. And another one was, what zip code are you in? Well, Wasilla, Alaska only has 2 zip codes. He was able to, he said within like an hour or 2 of research on Google, find the answer to all 3 questions, reset her account, stole her emails. Unfortunate for him, he then bragged about it on 4chan or 8chan, the hacker channel, got caught, arrested, and sent to jail, as any hacker should. But I don't know if he was really a hacker. He's more of a guy that knew how to use Google. But the defense of that is never put in the real answers. This is not Jeopardy. When they if they go, Roger, what was your high school mascot? It's the Kellum Knights. It's probably not that hard to find where I went to high school. Instead, I put Pizza 32. What's your mother's maiden name? Pizza 32. What's your favorite vet? Pizza. That never put in the real answers. It's insane if you do. People can look them up and research and hack them. So put in fake, nonsensical answers. The only problem is if you do this defense is you got to write down the question and the answer. That's what I do. I put it in my password manager, but at least I'm not going to let somebody just guess my high school mascot or something like that. And you'd be surprised at how many people you can just go up and go, hey, what's your password? I have for 20 years being a penetration tester, I would oftentimes walk up to the CEO's secretary. I go, hi, my name is Roger Grimes. I'm with Microsoft. I'm doing password penetration testing, auditing. I need to know the CEO's password. How many times did they give me the CEO's password? Every single time. They never didn't do it. So a lot of times, all you got to do is call. When I worked for another company called Foundstone, we actually went to random people on the street and we said, hey, if you tell us your password, we're trying to collect passwords here. We'll give you a chocolate bar or a free pen. And we got something like 40% of the people that we asked that to gave us the real password, which is just amazing. And you're like, there's no way. If you ever want to see a video, I don't have time to show you this one either, but Jimmy Kimmel has a password video that you can go watch on YouTube where he just asks. So his producers are in Hollywood asking people, what's your password? And you're like, the people aren't going to tell them. They do. Or this woman here, she's like, well, it's my cat's name and the year I was born. Like, oh, great. What's your cat's name? She then tells them the cat's name. They're like, what year were you born? And she says the year that she was born, right? Tells a complete stranger with a camera on a street what it is. So based upon all those sorts of attacks that I just covered, what password policy should you have to prevent those attacks? Well, I try to tell people, first, realize that most hacking attacks do not care about your password policy. And that's because they either steal your password somehow, and they don't care how long or short it is. So remember, 40 to 90% of all successful data breaches are because of social engineering, and social engineering does not care what your password is because they are socially engineering you out of it. 20 to 40% of all malicious data breaches happen because unpatched software, and if you have unpatched software, they don't care what your password is because they're just getting by because you didn't patch your software. Unpatched software and social engineering account for 70 to 90% of all successful data breaches. And so that means 70 to 90% of all attacks do not care what your password is. As a matter of fact, only 1 to 10% of attacks in most companies would ever be something that would care about your password. So really just, I tell people, having a good password policy is a good thing to do. It can't hurt you, but make sure you're patching your software and preventing social engineering before you worry about your password policy. And remember, password policy only impacts authentication attacks, and even then, only attacks against password guessing and cracking. So most organizations would be far better off spending time stopping social engineering and patching than worried about their password policy. But that said, it's always good to have a good password policy. Password policy is composed of length, the minimum length, complexity, useful lifetime, how long it can be used for, how long till the password can be reused. The same password can be reused again in the same system by default, like in a Windows system. I think you can't use your last 20 passwords or something. Account lockout should be enabled on most systems if it can be, which means if someone guesses too many times, it locks out the account or at least disables it for a preset period of time. And you should never have a password that's password or 123 or converti or your username or something like that. So you want to make sure that people aren't using very easily guessable passwords. And of course, you must protect any system that has your passwords and password hashes, because you don't want the attacker just bypassing the password and downloading it if they could. Now, for decades, the National Institute of Standards and Technology and NIST said in what was called their Authentication Guidelines that passwords must be long, complex, and frequently changed. And that is what everybody knows today, that your passwords must be long, must have complexity, must be frequently changed. And how frequently? Every 45, every 90 days, something like that. They recommended this about a decade and a half ago, almost 2 decades. And to this day, this is still the most common password policy that everybody runs. But in 2017, NIST went, hey, my bad, we said wrong. Really, you don't need to have long, complex, frequently changed passwords. In fact, the companies we've researched and the people that require long, complex, frequently changing passwords, they get compromised more because of those passwords than companies that use shorter, non-complex, not changing passwords. Let me say that again. NIST came out in 2017 in what's called their Digital Identity Guidelines. It's NIST Special Publication 800-63, and went, we were wrong. The old password policy advice made things worse. You should not require length, complexity, or you should not change passwords unless you think they've been compromised. So this is really wild, and this blew up the world because the world's like, what? And still to this day, there is not a single password recommendation, requirement, guide, law that actually does what NIST says. They all follow NIST's old advice. So 3 years later, most people and organizations don't know about what NIST has said. Almost no one actually uses it. Almost no one can use it, because if you were not to require long, complex, and changing passwords, you would probably fail an audit. I looked into the top 20 audit regulations and guidelines around the world. None of them use the new NIST recommendations. They all require the old NIST recommendations. So if you tried to use NIST's new recommendations that the data prove is a safer approach, you would not be in compliance with your IT security audit. So kind of wild. Although Microsoft did change the rules so that Microsoft's recommendation is, we're not going to give you a recommendation, do whatever you want. That's the most progressive policy I could find out there. But here are the attack types. Out of the 7, 8 attack types, here's the types of attacks. They don't care whether you have a weak or a strong password, because they just steal it. They just get it some other way. The only 2 types of password attacks that care about whether your password is strong or weak are password guessing and password hash cracking. The vast majority of attacks, like 99%, 98%, I'm making it up, the vast majority of attacks are these attacks up here, social engineering being the biggest one, or stealing it from you or asking you for it or something like that. Very few small percentage is the other types of attacks. Although remember, with hash cracking, they don't necessarily need to crack your hash. They are already in as admin or root or domain and have full control of your system and your network, and they could just replay the hash. The only reason they need to crack it is if they want to get some additional opportunity with your plain text version of your password. So there are some scenarios where password hash cracking could be advantageous. Like if they crack your password hash, and then they could log into like a plain text password portal, like your email login or something like that, and they don't necessarily have to be in the network or have all these ports and permissions. They can just use your password instead. Most people, if someone logs in with a login name and a password, most systems don't detect that, and they just think it's the real person. Although I have heard of a penetration tester like Kevin Mitnick. He broke into one Active Directory forest. He found an administrator's password hash, and then he cracked that password and found out that that attacker used it on another Active Directory forest. The administrator shouldn't have used it in the other Active Directory forest, but he did, so he was reusing passwords between the 2 forests. So by Kevin cracking one, Kevin was able to use it to crack on the other, and then download all the other password hashes and crack them as well. They're not very common scenarios why you really need to crack a password, but they do happen. But it's just 1 or 2% of attacks probably. So you want your passwords not to be easily guessable. To do that, you want your password to at least be 8 characters long and not be something commonly used like password or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to be guessed. But an 8-character kind of complex password prevents most password guessing attacks, especially if you have an account lockout enabled. If you don't, well, that's a bad thing. If you want your password hashes to be also uncrackable to resist hundreds of trillions of guesses, then you have to have a longer, more complex password. You need 16 characters or more with complexity. Remember, account lockouts, when that's enabled, that stops password guessing against portals and things like that. But password hash, the attacker grabs your hash, takes it back to the password hash cracking rig, and account lockout doesn't help at all. So what NIST said was that most attacks are not password cracking. They're really these other types of attacks are far more popular where they don't care what your password is. And because of that, as long as you have something that can't be easily guessed, you're safe. And that's what NIST said. NIST said, as you increase the number of characters and complexity of your password, the more likely your end users are to reuse the same password on many different websites. So NIST said, make sure you don't need to use long passwords. They don't have to be complex. You don't need to change them all the time. But that's NIST's argument there. But only you, really the central argument comes down to how much do you worry about password hash cracking? When you're worried about that, you want to have a complex password. They really, in the password world, it's called entropy, which is how random something is. Most human beings, it's hard for us to create truly random passwords and hard for us to remember and use them. Like the best we'll do if we make a highly random complex password, we'll use some type of word like Roger is a goon, and we'll replace some letters with an O and uppercase and lowercase something. So or Roger Grimes 3, that's complex. What a truly random high entropy password looks like is that gobbledygook right there. We don't like to create them. We certainly don't like to remember them. So if you're going to use one, usually you want a password manager program or something like that. But it's really hard to require true randomness and high entropy, especially from a human being, because we like to use words and things that we can remember. So the average human-generated complex password, again, is uppercase first character, lowercase second letter with a number 1 or 2 at the end. If there's some symbols, these symbols. Typically, when we look at billions of captured passwords, most of those passwords can be summarized by 20 characters, and most of them can be guessed within 10,000 tries or whatever. It's like this is a typical password you might see on somebody's system that's complex. It really isn't that complex, but it does stop password guessing attacks as long as you don't let them guess like 50,000 times a day. If you don't have account lockout enabled and they can guess a bazillion times, well, they're eventually going to guess that. But you really want a complex password. If you want to see if your password, how long it would take to crack it, there's a lot of password strength checking websites out there. What I would say, if you go to any of them, don't put in your real password. You don't want to give a stranger your real password. Just change some letters. Like if your real password is frog3, put in like frog4 or something like that. It's got the same level of complexity, but you're not giving them their real password. And also, if you look at Roger Grimes 2 or whatever, it'd only take 3 days. It's not really that complex to crack. But if I do a truly complex password, 41 trillion years, wow. But I could also do a passphrase like Roger jumped over the dog and cat, and that's actually more secure than the one in the middle, but I can remember it a lot easier. So, the best password to fight all attack types is long and complex passwords. Although if human beings have to do long and complex passwords, according to NIST, we'll reuse them more often. It defeats the whole purpose of having them. Many times I say, if you can use a password manager, use a password manager because they can create long and complex and unique passwords for every website, and you don't have to remember them. And they can even tell you, like, here's an example of mine where it's telling me, hey, Citibank got hacked and you need to change your passwords. My password manager proactively tells me if my password has been stolen by some hackers from the website I belong to, which is pretty cool. The negative is password managers don't work with all devices, browsers, or website services. Like you can't log into your laptop using a password manager usually, and it doesn't work with all browsers, and it's an extra, you got to get used to it or something like that. Multi-factor authentication is a really good thing. It significantly mitigates, a lot of attacks. Like, if someone's asking for your password, they're trying to trick you and social engineering you into giving you a password, but you have a multi-factor authentication token instead. Well, you can't give away your password because you don't have a password. The negative is that MFA only works about 2% of websites and services. So most of us today have a combination of one or more multi-factor authentication solutions we use, plus passwords, right? And people go, when are passwords going away? Not anytime soon. I think they're going to be with us at least another 10 years. We're going to be forever. If you're interested also, MFA can be hacked. If we all went to multi-factor authentication, hackers will still attack us. I've written a book on it. I've written a free ebook you can download. Even if you want to see how my brain can hack your MFA solution, you can go to our multi-factor authentication security assessment tool, download that. It will ask you like 12 to 20 questions so I can figure out what your MFA tool or solution is, and then I'll tell you how I could hack it. All MFA can be hacked. With that said, use MFA where you can. It's better than using a login name and password in most cases. If you want to find out every way I know how to hack MFA, you can also buy my book. But here's my password policy recommendations again, is that you need to first determine what your risk tolerance is and how you feel about password cracking attacks. Those are a very small percentage of attacks, like 1 or 2% at most. But if you're worried about those, you need a long, complex password. So let me get going over here here's my password policy recommendation. Use MFA where you can. When you can't use MFA, then you want to use a unique, unguessable password for every different website and service. If a password manager can be used, use very long and complex passwords. As long and complex as that website will allow, the password manager tool will help you make that. If you can't use a password manager tool, then you want at least an 8 to 12 character password with some minor complexity to defeat password guessing. If you're worried about password hash cracking, you want a 6 to 17 character password with lots of complexity. You want to enable account lockout wherever you can. I don't care what the value is. You just want to enable it so someone can't guess 50,000 times a day. Do not reuse passwords between any website and service. Don't allow or use one that's easily guessable, and change your passwords at least once a year, because sometimes they get leaked and you don't want a hacker looking back at your password from 4 years ago and finding out that it still works. So remember, the vast majority of password hashing attacks are eliminated by an 8-character or longer password, as long as you have enabled account lockout and you monitor and alert if there's an abnormal number of failed logins. Do not reuse passwords to any website or service. Don't allow someone to use an easily guessable password. Change them at least once a year. And if you're worried about password hash cracking, then increase the length to 16, 17 characters. So with that, by the way, if you want to find out I have a spreadsheet that if you send me an email to rogerg@noble4.com, I've got a spreadsheet where you can put in your password policy, and I will tell you how many guesses it would take to crack somebody's password and how long it would take. So, in general, could somebody with your password policy, would they be able to crack passwords based upon that policy? Send me an email at rogerg@noble4.com, and I'll send you those password hacking spreadsheets. I know we're running out of time now, so we only have a couple of minutes left. If we don't get to your questions today, email me at rogerg@noble4.com. You can follow me at LinkedIn and Twitter. But Mike and whoever, I apologize for taking up so much time, but let's take a question or two if we can.
Roger, we had one question, and that would be, are password policies really safe?
Well, I mean, so that, really safe mean, does it prevent a password attack that would be successful against that password policy? Again, if you send me an email, I'll send you the spreadsheet where you can actually put in your password policy, and I will tell you whether, given that password policy, would an attacker be able to crack it? So, let me say, most password policies are fairly safe as long as they say at least 8 characters or longer. That defeats. But hard part is that, like, one of the most common things I've said a bunch is don't reuse the same password across multiple websites and services. There's no way to prevent that from happening. There's nothing to stop an employee from using a particular password on your company's website and then also using it for Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. So you need to educate people about, hey, make sure you don't do this, because they can hack it once and then get into all your other accounts. So password policies are good things to have, but they're not perfect.